This lecture is on Michael Levin's book, Feminism and Freedom. Levin is a contemporary philosopher who teaches at City University of New York. Throughout the text, Levin is extremely critical of feminism. He offers his understanding of the central tenets of feminism in its contemporary form, that aside from anatomical differences, men and women are innately alike. Infant boys and girls are born with virtually the same capacities to acquire skills, and if raised identically, they develop identically. That men unfairly occupy positions of dominance, and the myth men are more aggressive has been perpetuated by raising boys to be orientated towards mastery, and girls geared towards people. If this stereotyping ceased, leadership would be equally divided between the sexes, and that these desirable changes pertaining to gender equality will require the complete transformation of society. Levin rejects the central tenets of feminism and talks about how feminism is founded in environmentalism. Environmentalism is the denial that innate sex differences have anything to do with the broad structure of society. Feminists interpret the differences of behavior between men and women as societal constructs to benefit men unfairly, instead of recognizing any innate gender differences that might explain why men and women behave differently. Levin isn't saying that men are better than women or women better than men. They simply have innate biological differences that lead them to behave differently. Levin says most people find the existence of innate sex differences self-evident. There are no highly evolved species whose males and females behave identically. The innateness of a wide range of sex differences in humans is uncontroversial within the scientific community. Anyone who has been a parent for many years has more than enough evidence that boys and girls are different. Feminists believe women are unfree under patriarchy. Yet, Levin asks, how can women be unfree under patriarchy when so much characteristically female behavior is done freely without the coercion of men? Some examples Levin gives is women voluntarily subordinate themselves to their husbands. Women voluntarily choose to give up their career to be stay-at-home moms and housewives. Women want the man to take the dominant role in the relationship. A feminist response would be that while women under patriarchy may be doing what they want, the conditions their desires were formed by were constrained by patriarchy. Patriarchy led them to desire to be submissive and dependent on men. Women have had no chance to acquire different wants. But Levin says women not having chosen their wants is a bad reason to deny women are free, since no one chooses their wants. It is argued by feminists women are unfree, even though they voluntarily subordinate themselves to their husbands, because they have been brainwashed to do so. Thus, the voluntarily chosen sex-type behaviors, like wanting men to take the dominant role in the relationship, are inauthentic preferences that enslave women, and reform requires women to temporarily act against their own traditionally feminine preferences until everyone's new behavior generates more authentic preferences. Levin says the feminist resolution is to deny people freedom to not go along with feminist reforms. He says feminism is anti-freedom. Feminism is an anti-democratic ideology. It is a program to turn men and women equally alike, and these attempts are futile. Innate gender differences of men and women express themselves through the typical preferences of men and women. When men and women act freely, they're going to make significantly different decisions. These free decisions are not products of oppression. Levin says feminists deny that equal opportunity could result in unequal outcomes. He says inequality of outcome does not mean inequality of opportunity. Environmentalism implies that any significant statistical disparity in outcome for men and women is due to discrimination. He says equalizing the sexes in personal behavior demands much surveillance and interference. However, it's impossible for big government to overcome the biological inevitability of unique sex roles. Levin says feminists believe the supposed powerlessness, confinement, and poverty of women and stereotypical beliefs made about them must have been caused in the same way the socially inferior position of blacks was caused. Levin sees anyone who takes the oppression analogy between blacks and women seriously as a feminist. Anyone who thinks raising children to disregard gender is as important as raising children to disregard skin color is also a feminist. Levin sees hostility to capitalism and admiring Marxism as virtually another distinguishing mark of feminism. Levin says feminists are suspicious of the family, attributing to sexual inequality. Levin says 19th century feminism differs from contemporary feminism. He says it's a distortion of history to view the suffragettes of a century ago as forerunners of today's feminists. They were concerned with well-defined legal reforms and understood innate sex differences between men and women. Levin says contemporary feminists truly lack the need to reform any laws. Private discrimination against women has been illegal since 1964. Public discrimination at the state level has been illegal since 1972. The actual state of affairs is that there is an extensive institutionalized preference that favors women over men. Levin says there has been a false patriarchy narrative of human history. Women in past eras suffered much that would be considered intolerable today. But so did most men. Women didn't vote until the 20th century. However, hardly anyone voted until the 18th century. Levin points out that women are generally well off in relation to men. Women live longer, enjoy better health, are less prone to insanity, less prone to alcoholism, less prone to drug abuse. The female felony rate is 5% of the male rate. And Levin says that even far older than the notion of universal rights is the idea that men must protect women, and men have endured enormous hardships protecting women. If sex roles really are to be perceived as men receiving dominance in exchange for the risk of violent death, it is hardly clear men got the better deal. Levin says that no doctrine is more influential in shaping institutional and public life than feminism. Under federal law, a prospective employer is forbidden to ask a female job applicant if she plans to have children. The Supreme Court has outlawed pension plans that use the greater lifespan of women as a factor in computing premiums. Public speakers can no longer use he or man as gender neutral comfortably. The quota mentality now dominates all phases of employment, where a certain amount of women have to be hired. Levin points out the feminist censorship of school books. The courts have involved themselves in university tenure decisions involving women. The courts have heavily penalized organizations for failing to pay women what the courts deem they deserve. National TV networks instruct their writers to include non-traditional women in every script. In France, the government passed a law forbidding the proportion of male candidates in local elections to exceed 70%. Levin says ideology has been thoroughly spread that women have been and remain systematically mistreated. And he also says that gender differences have been extremely minimized. There's a strong belief women need to work outside the home, and there's an understanding the elements of a satisfying life are essentially the same for men and women. Levin says certain generalizations about men and women are rooted in biology and should not be ignored. To say that men instinctively protect their families is to say that men are programmed to learn what is in their environment counts as a threat and find what is available in the environment to counter these threats. An Eskimo father storing blubber and an American father buying life insurance may both be acting from the same identical biological drive for protection. Many sex differences, such as the discrepancy between girls and boys in mathematics, appear or become heightened at puberty. To explain these effects environmentally requires the same environmental factors affect nearly all boys and all girls at the same time. This is highly unlikely. If differentiation in mathematical performance between boys and girls is part of a biological maturation program, no such coincidence need be given. Levin says, desirable or not, sex stereotypes being universal strongly points to them being true. Sex stereotypes are beliefs about important matters. Errors about important matters tend to die out. So sex stereotypes are likely to be true. Why has every society socialized boys and girls differently in the first place? If males and females have equal genetic predisposition for aggression and nurturance, why not have half all human societies encourage women to be aggressive and men to be nurturing? Environmentalism must treat this as a coincidence or fall back on a male conspiracy theory. Levin says culture itself is a product of men and women freely acting out their innate dispositions. Innate dispositions are greatly what produce the culture. Levin says there is widespread agreement among cognitive scientists that males excel at spatial and mathematical skills, while females excel in verbal skills. These differences appear in childhood, increase during puberty, and stabilize thereafter. Girls begin to speak easier than boys. The male advantage in mathematical abstraction is found greatest on tests involving geometrical reasoning. This male advantage in mathematics isn't a result of girls simply not performing as well on tests than boys due to higher anxiety level in girls, because of how girls outperform boys on the verbal portion of the SAT. If boys are steered to mathematics because of the stereotype of math being masculine and not through a male biological drive, where did the stereotype come from? What's so inherently masculine about numbers? Levin says it's simpler to explain the perceived masculinity of math as a product of males being more biologically inclined to excel at math. That there is a stronger male inclination to manipulate physical objects than female inclination has been found in studies of behavior. Even as infants, males tend to be more interested in objects than people. Female infants respond more readily to the human voice than male infants. The male is inclined to express his intention in action, while the female in communication. These differences manifest themselves early in life in a variety of ways. Boys and girls are equally sociable, but boys and girls differ in the kind of social skills they exhibit. Boys' interest in other people is functional. Can they play games or build a treehouse? Girls seek out more intimate personal relationships. Levin says Darwinism explains sex differences when it comes to power hierarchies. Men with genes that program desire for intercourse with as many females as possible and a readiness to battle like-minded males for access to the females are more likely to survive. A female does best by choosing a male who demonstrates the willingness and ability to protect her and her offspring by victory in those battles with other males. A biological tendency to withhold sexual favors as a reward for the daring male is selected in females. The enjoyment of shining before females and vanquishing other males is biologically selected in males. Males enjoy courting, and women enjoy being courted. Levin then offers examples of this kind of sexual selection occurring in the animal kingdom. And if this kind of sexual selection occurs in the animal kingdom, it is more plausible that this Darwinist sexual selection theory is true for humans as well. And if this Darwinist theory is true, then men probably are innately more competitive than females. Levin says men being innately more aggressive than women has concrete implications. From the beginning of the historical and archaeological record, males have devoted an astonishing measure of their energy to killing each other. Violent crime is a male pursuit in every society. Cross-cultural studies consistently find women dreaming of children and crying, and men dreaming of sex and weapons. Every society that has ever existed has associated family authority with the male and conferred the overwhelming majority of positions of power on males. Levin says the male advantage in dominance aggression makes patriarchy inevitable because men will always strive harder than women to reach the top of hierarchies they encounter. Male dominance expresses the free choices of individual men and the free choices of women to do other things. There are those who are concerned the persistence of gender stereotypes unfairly penalizes women who are not interested in feminine things. Levin says, while a woman with interests that aren't typical of women may face difficulties through gender stereotypes, these difficulties must be balanced with the benefits of stereotyping men and women. Sex stereotypes affirm the majority that their preferences are normal and desirable, says Levin. While the one woman in 50 who does not want children may be made uncomfortable by the message that there is something wrong with her, the same message is reinforcing to the other 49. Men and women do different sorts of work, and women earn lower average wages. Levin says the question being raised should not be whether women are receiving the same pay as men for the same work. This was settled in 1963 when the Equal Pay Act made it illegal to pay a woman less than a man for the same job. The problem is men and women tend to do different jobs, and jobs dominated by men tend to pay more. Now, feminism would argue that this is due to an unjust, oppressive patriarchy. However, the cause of these differences in how much men and women earn in the workplace are differences in the motives that lead men and women to earn money. These differences in motives for earning money are often brought about by different innate sex differences between men and women. Most married working women choose to work to supplement their husband's income. On average, the full-time working man works more hours a week than his female counterpart. 44 hours a week for men, 35.7 hours a week for women. Unmarried women often see work as an interim between school and marriage. Working mothers are expected to care for their children as well. These working mothers gravitate towards jobs permitting easy entry, exit, and re-entry to and from the workplace. Men tend to seek more prestigious jobs. Men have a greater innate dominance aggression, which manifests itself in greater competitiveness. Men will succeed more often than women in attaining highly paid positions because they try harder more often. Levin says just because there is inequality when it comes to which jobs men and women hold, it doesn't mean that difference in work and wage earning for men and women can't be the result of free decisions of men and women. Comparable worth theory is the contention that male-dominated jobs pay more than female-dominated jobs because women aren't being paid enough for how valuable the work they are doing is. The goal of pay equity is to raise the wages of predominantly female jobs in the workplace to match the wages of similarly valued male jobs. Comparable worth advocates promise the wage gap will not be closed by cutting male salaries, but by temporarily slowing down the growth of men's salaries until women's salaries have caught up. However, Levin says a man who gets a smaller raise that he otherwise would have received has received a pay cut because of comparable worth. It helps no one to hold down a husband's wages so that his wife's can be artificially boosted. Holding down male salaries and inflating female salaries would lead to a massive disincentive to work. Women would be getting more without having to work harder, and men would be receiving the same amount even if they did work harder. Levin says men would likely try to invade the newly well-paid female-dominated jobs. There would then be no men to take the unpleasant jobs like collecting garbage if high wages for it were no longer available. Levin sees the belief that men at the top are consciously trying to hold down women to be an implausible conspiracy theory. It makes no economic sense. If employers are willing and able to rig substandard wages for women, why would they not also rig substandard wages for men? Another comparable worth argument is that there is a cultural bias against women, so a job's association with women devalues it, leading to less pay. Levin says female sex-type jobs are actually seen as more prestigious. While the most prestigious jobs are male-dominated, the least prestigious jobs, like groundskeeper, are also male-dominated. Female-dominated jobs tend to hover in the middle. Levin moves on to discussing quotas in his book. Levin understands quotas as the policy of favoring women and minorities in situations which merit has formerly been the ideal criterion. On the basis of past discrimination, women and blacks are thought to have suffered. When it is assumed that there should be as many women as men in some position, merit gets replaced by quotas. The government incentive for the adoption of quotas tends to be the threat of termination of funds. Any educational institution receiving federal money must submit an institution-wide affirmative action plan. Levin gives some examples of quotas. A federal court has ordered that 25% of all new West Coast longshoremen must be female until 20% of all longshoremen. Equipment must be redesigned to accommodate the physical limitations of women. A federal court barred Western Electric from closing an unprofitable plant on the grounds that closure would necessitate the dismissal of women hired under an affirmative action plan. Levin says quotas have nothing to do with giving someone a job they were discriminatorily denied. He says they involve hiring or promoting a given number of blacks, Hispanics, or women, regardless of whether these particular individuals have been wronged, and regardless of the qualifications or culpability of competing white males. Levin says gender quotas are the most pervasive influence of feminism on the American economy. Decisions about employment, union contracts, apprenticeships, admission to professional schools, and the casting and directing of motion pictures are made with an eye towards sex and skin color. A case for quotas is that they produce role models for women to pursue jobs ordinarily occupied by men. But Levin says this case for quotas ignores the possible negative consequences of inserting less than the best candidates into positions on which lives depend, like piloting commercial airliners. The case for quotas seems to wrongfully assume most people could do most things pretty well if given the chance. The creation of role models argument really has nothing to do with equal opportunity, says Levin. Creation of role models doesn't offer women more freedom to pursue occupations they wish. It just encourages women to pursue jobs they already don't want. The role model argument is unpersuasive because of the injustice that it does to more qualified men getting passed up for jobs. Levin says the government is interfering in the hiring process and disadvantaging white males by requiring discrimination against them. The government is denying white males protection it extends to blacks, Hispanics, females, and other populations by promoting white male discrimination. When we stop rewarding workers based on merit, there will be less productivity. A compensation argument for quotas is an argument that quotas are demanded by justice because they give today's blacks and women the jobs they would have gotten had there been no sexual or racial discrimination in the past. The argument says quotas compensate blacks and women for the competitive abilities they would have had if their ancestors had been treated fairly. Reserving jobs for less qualified women and blacks is fair to the bypassed, better qualified males because males are only better qualified because they benefited from such a discriminatory culture. To let better qualified white males claim those jobs is to let them profit from wrongdoing of a white male biased culture, even if they themselves did not contribute to it. Levin believes the argument is faulty because it is impossible to identify the particular minority members who would have occupied better positions had discrimination never occurred. In his response against the compensation argument, Levin offers 5 specific conditions that need to be met in order for there to be a legitimate compensation claim. The first is that an injury must be shown. The injured party must be identified. The cost to the injured party must be established. Those who inflict or profited from the injury must be identified. And restitution must be feasible. Levin says that no injuries have been the result of sex stereotyping, so advocates of gender quotas must be forced back on the psychological injury of sex stereotyping. But Levin says that sex stereotyping hasn't been the result of injury, but is merely the inevitable manifestation of innate sex differences. Levin says the inability for injury to be shown by sex stereotyping makes it unnecessary to ask who the injured by sexist discrimination were. Levin further asks, how is it knowable which women would have gotten ahead of which men had the situation been fair? He says black disadvantages at least appear traceable to past wrongs because blacks form a coherent subgroup within the general population. But women do not form an autonomous subpopulation the way blacks do. Women's ancestors are everybody. The average woman is assumed to have gained as much from her father's ill-gotten advantages as she lost from her mother's underserved handicaps. Levin points out that women marry men. For most practical purposes, a wife has full use for her husband's assets. If the average man is better off than he should be because the average woman is worse off, they combine their resources and split the difference when they marry. Whenever a man loses a job to a woman, just because he is a man, his wife is deprived. While gender quotas compensate some members of the alleged female victim group, they deprive other women. Levin says that dominance aggression, the ability most crucial for success in competitive situations, is physiologically determined to be greater in men. Women do not want to get to the top as much as men do. The lack of female drive to get to the top is hardly an injury. Levin says quotas require the award of jobs to individuals who assumingly are not the best able to perform them, and in some cases absolutely unable to perform them. Thus, quotas are not feasible ways of making compensation or restitution. The dancer with a crippled foot by the careless piano mover does not ask the moving company to hire him to perform. After all, it is due to the company's negligence that he can't dance well anymore. He asks for the monetary equivalent of his lost skill, not the right to do things he is no longer able to do. It is therefore odd that compensation for women should take the form of jobs when the grounds for compensating them is the lack of skills necessary for those jobs. Levin talks about publishing houses who endorse texts for children that promote a feminist agenda. Silva Burdett demands that no occupation should be shown as reflecting masculinity or femininity, and textbooks which avoid male and female stereotyping will more accurately represent reality. McGraw-Hill prescribes women and girls should be shown as having the same abilities, interests, and ambitions as men. When these guidelines acknowledge gender differences at all, they attribute these differences exclusively to socialization and discrimination. Macmillan says, because of the societal rules that have been traditionally assigned to our culture to women and minority people, white males are credited with most of the significant achievements in science. Even so, artwork or science books should depict women and minority people at least 50% of the time, avoiding sexual and racial stereotypes. Girls must not be shown mostly indoors and hovering near doorways, sheltered from the elements, carrying umbrellas when boys are not. Motherhood is an activity that's never portrayed favorably in these guidelines. Given these guidelines, the books that result are unsurprising. Levin mentions children's stories of girls being more assertive and boys being more passive. Meg was practicing karate while the boys had lain in hammocks all afternoon. Children's books of every sort have been transformed or relied on featuring women in improbable positions of command, physical strength, and expertise. Princesses slay and rescue dragons. Female firefighters shovel coal. Women man work crews. Women serve as subway engineers and railroad inspectors. Richard Scarry's classic books for children have been revised to suggest that the police force of an average town is largely female. Dialogue is so arranged that every bit of information supplied by a male character is matched by an equally knowing comment from a female character. Levin sees the feminist depictions in children's literature to be dishonest. These men and women are not airline pilots or batting champs. While fairy tales and children's literature are fiction, they still express metaphorical truths. Beauty and the Beast promotes the message that love redeems. Pinocchio promotes that courage is good. But feminist tales make no claim to metaphorical insight and are meant to be taken as literally true. In his text, Levin goes on to talk about feminism at colleges. The most common justification for women's studies programs is women experience the world differently from men. However, this contradicts the feminist environmentalist belief that men and women do not inherently differ, says Levin. It might be argued that there is a distinct female view of the world due to women's oppression, not their inherent differences from men. But in that case, the appropriate courses should be based on the perspective of oppressed people in general, not specifically women. There is a feminist argument for women's studies programs that virtually every subject has been developed by men, so it's time for women to have a fair go. But Levin says this argument cannot be taken seriously because the university curriculum is already sex neutral. Material is taught when it is judged by competent scholars of the relevant discipline to be significant. Calculus classes are offered because calculus is important in describing nature, not because men invented it. There is a feminist argument that equal time should be given to men and women when it comes to studying history as an academic subject. Levin sees this equal time principle to be useless for assessing what is historically significant enough to be covered in a history text. The world's women do not form a coherent group history. They do not have their own unique geographic location or cultural distinctiveness. They don't have their own myths, art, or language. What they have in terms of culture is shared with by men. All that a modern American woman shares with the wife of a 5th century Chinese peasant are the biological-based traits that feminism minimizes or denies. Levin says certain periods and groups have had more of an influence on humanity than others, so these periods and groups should be given greater prominence in historical accounts. It is how this world came to be that historians are trying to understand. Predominantly male activities like technology, war, and law meet the criteria for significant historical phenomena more fully than the activities of women. Levin says women can certainly be subject of respectable coursework, but such work should be done in traditional departments, not a women's studies department. The nature of gender differences are empirical questions that can be studied in biology, psychology, sociology, political science, and history. This kind of study will differ greatly from the feminist ideology being proclaimed in women's studies courses. Levin points out that governments have thrown their weight behind feminism in higher education. Everyone who has ever served on an academic hiring committee has been told by senior administrators that some appointment has to go to a woman. Every hiring decision at every university has to be approved by its affirmative action office.